Welcome to our next edition of our podcast series, Bilateral Bites. I'm Tanya Spisbah, the Director of the Australia-India Institute in Delhi, and we're joined here on the eve of Independence Day with Baijayant Jay Panda. Thank you very much for being here. It's such a pleasure to have you. Jay Panda is the National Vice President and Spokesperson of the BJP. He's been a four-time Member of Parliament of India. He's also been associated with the India-USA Forum of Parliamentarians from its founding in 2001 and was its chairman for 15 years. He has been awarded the Bharat Asmita National Award for Best Parliamentary Practices by the Honourable Chief Justice of India in 2008. In Parliament and in public life, Jay Panda is passionate and espouses the causes of his home state of Odisha, as well as other national causes close to his heart, such as economic development, education, information technology, and data privacy. We've had the opportunity of having Jay Panda as an avid supporter of Australia-India relations as well, having participated in the Australia-India Leadership Dialogue and also been a supporter of the Australia-India Youth Dialogue. So Jay, really thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure, and I'm looking forward to this.
So the first question I have for you on the eve of Independence Day is about India's rise in global influence. Celebrating 73 years of independence tomorrow, India stands today as a global influencer across many domains. This includes international security and has recently been unanimously voted again as the non-permanent member for the UN Security Council, as chair of the World Health Executive Board at a time when global health has never been more pertinent, and obviously will be the future host of the G20 for its 75th anniversary in 2022. In recent times, India has shown extraordinary leadership, not only in its neighbourhood, but also globally, participating in the G20 virtual summit and calling for global leadership on the issue early, as well as being a supplier of medicines and PPE at a time of crisis to more than 150 countries across the world. However, India has also faced its own challenges, both internally, dealing with COVID-19 and the economic and social impact of that, as well as internationally in terms of a disturbed neighbourhood. It's a big question, but taking all of these issues together, how do you see India today, and what are the key challenges that are facing India in 2020?
Indeed. I think many of the issues that you mentioned about India coming to take a more prominent role in global narratives and discussions, I think is only appropriate for a country of our size, considering the length and depth of our civilization, and the fact that it is the world's single largest democracy. In fact, it's the largest democracy the history of humankind has ever seen. This is a transition that's been underway for a while and has speeded up under Prime Minister Modi. So I've often used the phrase that after gaining independence, India sort of went into a bunker mentality because of a long period of colonialism when its share of global trade had fallen. Basically, confidence had eroded. And because that engagement with the rest of the world had been through trade, through the East India Company, India also closed its borders to trade. And we did succeed in the democracy project. But on the economic front, we saw many others, many of our peers in Asia and elsewhere, overtake us and become transformed from third world countries to first world countries. Now, we started regaining our confidence only in this past generation, which is the third generation after independence. And gradually, with higher growth rates, with the rise of the technology industry and other such aspects, India has been gaining more prominence and interest in the rest of the world. But particularly in the last 5 or 6 years, Prime Minister Modi has transformed India's foreign policy with the energy that he brings. And you can see this in the interest and the respect that India has started now acquiring everywhere in the world, but especially in the free world, especially among democracies. So it's only natural that a country of our size should play a role in this. So I call this transition the transition from diffidence to confidence. But it is a confidence that is not of arrogance, and it's not a confidence that is hostile, contrary to how people react to some other large countries growing. I have experienced throughout the world, my counterparts and people involved in foreign policy and business welcome the rise of India. Now, the second part of your question, it's indeed, we've had challenges in the neighborhood. We've had the longest stretch of state-sponsored cross-border terrorism that we have faced from our western border. This is a challenge which the world has increasingly become more sensitive to over the last 2 decades since 9/11 happened. But we face this on a weekly basis. On a weekly basis, we have terrorists coming across into our border and taking lives and causing disruption. Now, this is caused by one nation, Pakistan, which is a smaller nation, and it's an irritant, but that's not the major problem. The major problem is a much larger nation, which is China. And this didn't used to be spoken about very openly in geopolitics until recently, until in the last 5 or 7 years, with their attitude of sponsoring such rogue states and also causing troubles to other democracies around the world, including Australia, including the kind of pressures they've put and the controversies they've got into in Australia. So this is something that we need to face up to, but this is not just an Indian challenge, because China has grown by the same rules of the global order that the rest of the world now wants it to abide by. And this is where the democracies of the world are coming together. India and Australia and Japan and the United States are all interested that China should play by the rules of openness, of fair play, of the open sea lanes, and so forth, so on and so forth. Finally, about COVID, indeed, this is also another major challenge, and it is not just an Indian challenge. It has affected every single nation in the world, economically and in public health wise. Now, here also, we had a major challenge because the kind of discipline that was required for lockdowns and for social distancing. Now, it's easier done in a totalitarian country. In some other countries, if the top leadership just mandates it, it happens. But in democracies, particularly large, diverse democracies, it takes a lot of coaxing and communicating. And this is where Prime Minister Modi has excelled. He has been on TV repeatedly. He's constantly holding coordination meetings with state chief ministers. Now, each of our states is like a large European country. And so you've seen this exhortations by the top leadership of the country, and you've seen tremendous commitment by the frontline warriors, the nurses, the doctors, and others who are involved in this fight. And as a result, despite the fact that, of course, it's a serious challenge, of course, it hits the economy, and of course, we have had tens of thousands of deaths, the reality is what had been predicted was far worse. What had been predicted 5 months ago is that India would more or less collapse, that we'd have tens of millions of infections and millions of deaths. And that's not happened. Only a fraction of that came true because of India's response. And indeed, in terms of fatalities in terms of population, we are the lowest in the world. We should not take it lightly. We are not. And there is still a way to go, quite some time to go before we are out of the woods. But India has come together on this issue and has dealt with this challenge, I think, rather well.
Well, an extraordinary response that has dealt with security, health, economy. And I'd like to ask you about education as well as we go through our discussion today. Just on health, I note that you pointed out the lowest fatalities in the world, and that is indeed extraordinary. I think people often forget that India is now, I think, the third country to have crossed 2 million cases after the United States and Brazil, and that's a staggering number. But I think if we compare it to proportion of population, it's still a much lower number than either the US or Brazil. And indeed, when you talk about fatalities, it's been extremely low in India. What do you think are some of the reasons for the low cases of fatalities? And in addition, so that's the public health management aspect. In addition, on health, India seems to be very much a pioneer in developing a vaccine as well. So together with the United States, Europe, Australia, and others, India seems to be working very hard on the health innovation aspect for the global development of a vaccine. Did you want to comment on that aspect as well?
Indeed. So 2 million cases sounds like a high number, and it is indeed. But keep in mind that we have 1.3 billion, more than 1.3 billion population. And something else that's important, I referred to this a little bit earlier. Epidemiologists had predicted back in March that in a matter of few months, India would have 500 million cases, not 2 million. They had predicted 500 million cases and at least 2 million deaths. So in comparison to that, we have 2 million cases and 45,000 deaths, which is bad by itself, but nowhere near what had been predicted. So I would definitely call it a relatively competent and good response to the situation, to the pandemic. There are many reasons. As I've mentioned earlier, I think the leadership made a huge difference. Otherwise, India has always been accused of lacking state capacity. But here, we demonstrated that the Prime Minister's exhortations clicked. Also, surveys showed that the Prime Minister's popularity went, he was already one of the most popular leaders ever, but his popularity ratings were hovering in the mid-90s, 93, 94%. So you could sense that something is clicking. There is a bond between what the country is trying to do and the population's response. So I think that was the single biggest factor. There are many other factors. I think many aspects of the Indian state rose to the challenge. So, for example, in the beginning, India did not used to manufacture any PPE kits. But within a short space, India became the second largest manufacturer of PPE kits in the world. Similarly, ventilators were not being manufactured in India. We used to depend on imported ventilators. But again, in a matter of 2 months, India became a significant producer, manufacturer of ventilators. So I think industry also responded. Innovation happened in India. These all made a difference. And you're right, India has supplied prophylactic medicines such as hydroxychloroquine to other countries as well. And India has now is already very advanced in vaccine trials. There was a very interesting article in the media just the other day that hopefully there will be vaccines that will be going through this cycle very quickly and be available on the market. And India is expected to become the largest supplier or the largest manufacturer of the vaccines for not just itself, but for around the world. And scale does make a difference. And having the scale that we do have and our attitude being of cooperation with the rest of the world, rather than what some other large countries have done by hiding the initial cases of the coronavirus, which then led to a breakout before it could be stopped. Our attitude is different, and the cooperation matters with the rest of the world.
Indeed, cooperation is key. And in discussing India's leadership in and agility in moving to exports of PPE and ventilators, because it was able to move with such agility into production. It makes me think of the recent CII report on reorienting India's export endeavour in the COVID world. And I believe Rajnath Singh, the Defence Minister, has also foreshadowed that in Prime Minister Modi's Independence Day speech tomorrow, he will be talking to how to boost India's export endeavours, including perhaps import restrictions on things like medical devices, but also on defence products, in order to boost Indian defence manufacturing. Did you want to comment a little bit on India's export endeavours and domestic manufacturing, and in which key sectors we could expect to see India rise?
Indeed. In fact, this is an issue on which many industry bodies have been interested in, and I've had similar dialogues with others. The phrase that the Prime Minister has championed is called Atmanirbhar India, which is self-reliant, self-belief, self-confidence. And there was a worry, which is misplaced, that India may be going back to the bad old days when our economy was cordoned off and not integrated with the rest of the world. Now, that's not what the intention is. And let me make it very clear. We were on the wrong side of history when our economy was closed, and in a more open setup, many other Asian countries developed very rapidly. We have been opening up our economy, just like the rest of the world. But you can see that it has been taken advantage of. The system has been gamed by certain other countries by dumping and by capturing market share, and also by using the market presence for strategic objectives. So, India has banned dozens of apps from China because they were not, there was security risk. There is a cyber security risk. So a part of the measures are to ensure that we are not undermining ourselves by openness. We are absolutely open to, the kind of trade we have with Australia and with America and with the open societies. But when you're trading and you're receiving investment from societies that are not open, that indulge in cyber warfare, and we have recently had a clash on our northern borders because of what China has done. So we need to be very clear that the openness of our economy should not lead to a situation that is being exploited by nations that deliberately want to undermine our setup. So that's one thing. Think of this as incentivizing investment in India, incentivizing domestic production, but also foreign investment and foreign technology to come in on a purely open commercial basis, not with the strategic intent of undermining India. So when Defense Minister spoke of restricting certain items only for domestic production, obviously these are items where we have the capacity, but we have not been exploiting it. We have not been developing it, and it's been left open for others to take advantage of. So we have no problem acquiring technology and defense acquisitions from other countries. We have been buying defense acquisitions from the US, from Russia, from Israel. We have strategic understandings with Australia and with Japan, for example, for nuclear fuel.
And recent Rafale purchases from France, for example, as well.
Rafale from France, indeed. So these are countries that are open countries, that are democracies, most of them, and they are not seeking to undermine us. So that's one of the issues. But India will continue to seek foreign direct investment. India will continue to be open to the rest of the world. Let me give a particular statistic here that's important. Under Prime Minister Modi, India's ranking on the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index has been stupendously successful. It has improved from worse than 140 of all countries to now in the range of 60. And the Prime Minister's stated goal is that India should be in the top 50 on the ease of doing business. And then that's just the starting point. We actually ought to keep improving until we are in the top 30 and the top 20, according to me. So you can look forward to a situation where India is not closing off its economy. It is just ensuring that strategically we are not being undermined. And India will remain open to other open societies to come in and partner with us.
No, that's wonderful and very clear. You mentioned the ease of doing business ratings, and indeed it's moved from 140 to, I think you said, 60. During Prime Minister Modi's Independence Day speech last year, he in fact mentioned wanting to be a top 50 economy for ease of doing business, and also that within the decade, India should be a $5 trillion economy. Obviously, all economies have been hit hard by COVID. All economies are experiencing either negative or close to negative growth, with the exception, I think, of one. Where do you see India tracking on its aims to be a top 50 ease of doing business destination, and indeed on being a $5 trillion economy? Are we still on track for this decade? And if not, what's the anticipated timeline given this incredible global economic shock?
So on the ease of doing business index of the World Bank, every year for the past 6 years, India has been making stupendous improvements. In some of these years, we have set the record for improvement year on year. So we are on, coming into the 60s to come into the top 50 is just a matter. It could happen this year when it comes out in October, or if not this year, hopefully by next year latest. So that's not a major reach anymore. Our effort has to be to go beyond being in the top 50 to keep on improving. Now, as far as being a $5 trillion economy, this is a milestone that the Prime Minister has been championing, and correctly so, because for the size of our country, it's only natural that we should be at least at that level and aspire to being a 10 trillion and more economy. Now, we have been improving rapidly. For most of the last several years, India has been the world's fastest growing large economy under Prime Minister Modi. And we are now already the 5th largest economy in the world, having recently surpassed nations like France and being in the same league as Germany and UK and so on. So obviously the coronavirus pandemic, as you said, has hit every country except one. And that has caused a delay. When the Prime Minister, in his last championing of the $5 trillion target at last year's Independence Day speech, there was obviously no COVID on the horizon. So this is a completely black swan event, which came from nowhere and disrupted all economies of the world. So it's only normal to expect that this will cause a little bit of a delay. But I don't expect that delay to be something that is insurmountable, because you've seen in other countries, there is a bounce back happening. And so also in India. If you look at unemployment figures in India, compare them to April, which got very severely hit, and compare that with June and July, you're seeing that employment is bouncing back. You're seeing that manufacturing is bouncing back. You're seeing very massive investments happening in some of the new economy sectors, such as technology and telecom, and so on and so forth. So I'm very, very confident that the $5 trillion economy milestone may be slightly delayed, but very much on the end. There is no doubt that India is going to be the 3rd largest economy in the world within just the foreseeable future of a few years.
No, these are extraordinary targets, and certainly India is improving. I believe there was a slowing of the economy from approximately 7.8% growth around 2014 down to the 4-5% by 2019. But it's still true exactly that India is one of the fastest, if not the fastest, largest growing economy in the world. You've mentioned investment in technology as well. I just wanted to explore your ideas on the recent investment in a submarine optical fibre cable connecting Andaman and Nicobar Islands to the mainland. This seems an extraordinary feat, and one which will allow for cheaper and better telecom connectivity to the Indian Union territory, as well as to ASEAN countries like Vietnam, Cambodia and Laos. National General Secretary of the BJP, Ram Madhav, has spoken extensively on the importance of ASEAN and on India's connectivity to ASEAN and the Indo-Pacific, and has mentioned that the Indo-Pacific is indeed the fastest growing, most dynamic region, both for economy and security. In your view, how important is the Indo-Pacific to India strategically and economically today?
Before answering that, I just want to make a slight clarification. There's a general misperception along the lines of what you had mentioned, that India was growing rapidly back in 2014 and it had slipped down. The more accurate figure is, even in the first quarter of 2019, that is 2018-19, India was growing at more than 8%. And in the year and a half from the first quarter of 2018-19 till the end of last year, till end of 2019, India had gone down to about 4.5% growth rate. But this was again when most of the global economies were going down for a variety of reasons. There was a slowdown. The interesting bit of news is that it seemed to have bottomed out by December 2019. If you look at the quarterly and the month-on-month figures, there was a slight uptick in December of 2019 before the COVID pandemic hit. So that has extended the slowdown, and of course, it's gone into negative territory. So that's one of the reasons I'm very confident that the bounce back will not take that much time.
And to your point, and I think it's a very good point to mention, India also went through several internal microeconomic adjustments for the healthier future of the economy, including, of course, the GST and demonetization, to have a long-term target for more sustainable growth and for better integration with global markets by having a national GST. So obviously these are things that once implemented will have short-term negative impacts in order to invest in the long term.
Yes, and even 2 years after implementing those major structural changes, India had
Mm,
already bounced back to more than 8.2% before that slowdown happened. So that's why I'm very
sure,
confident that the resumption to high growth rate is not very far away. Now, you've raised a very
sure.
important question about the Indo-Pacific, and
Yeah.
my friend and colleague Ram Madhavji has already spoken about this. India has had historical connections throughout the Indian Ocean and Indo-Pacific region. If you look at our presence and involvement throughout Southeast Asia, all the way up to Vietnam and Japan. But we had these decades of diffidence that I was talking about earlier, when India did not participate in the shaping of geopolitics, especially in this region. That is changing, and as I mentioned earlier, it is being welcomed by other countries, especially open societies. So nations like Australia and Japan and South Korea and the US, which are large, important, democratic economies, which have a stake in the Indo-Pacific and the Indian Ocean region, we all have shared values. The point I was making is that it is in the interest of all these democratic, open, large economies in Asia and in the Indo-Pacific, Indian Ocean region to work together to ensure that the smaller nations are not bullied and the sea lanes are kept open.
Indeed, you keep making some strong points about security as we talk about trade and economy and the Indo-Pacific. And we raised even at the beginning of the discussion the importance of keeping our maritime seas open. We talked about India, Japan, Australia, and the United States coming together, which has been again deemed the Quad Security Dialogue. You've also mentioned China and the role it's playing in the region. In 2017, when Australia rejoined the Quad, in the same year, China started a security dialogue of its own with Afghanistan and Pakistan. In 2017, the same year that India was invited to join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization together with Russia and the Central Asian economies, Pakistan was again included in that discussion as well. Where do you see India being able to address its regional security issues and global security issues? And will India be using its role as a non-permanent member on the Security Council to address some of those issues? Or will that be, again, a challenge, noting that China is also on the UN Security Council as a permanent member?
So China's patronage of rogue states is something I've mentioned earlier.
Yes.
And when it comes to Pakistan, China tries to portray it as as India being a regional power with a feud with Pakistan. Now, we really have no fundamental feud with Pakistan. India has made it very clear that we wish Pakistan well, but we are not going to tolerate terrorism sponsored by the state of Pakistan, sent across our borders to try and disrupt India. And so this is the real issue. And when it comes to China foiling attempts in the United Nations to designate terrorist organizations and to designate individuals as terrorists who have an open track record. They are wanted by the UN, they are wanted by the US and other nations' security forces, and yet China protects them. That's what creates hurdles. But Pakistan is not a major issue. Pakistan survives on it used to survive on aid from the US and other Western nations, and today it is basically a client state of China. The real fundamental issue is not Pakistan, it is China. So if the democracies of the world can align and make China behave responsibly, then I don't think we would have problems of the kind that we are having on our borders. And it's not just us. When China unilaterally tries to change the not only borders with India, but also asserts its sudden new claims on islands such as the Senkaku Islands in Japan and the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea. These are all problems. So we should not see these regional problems that India faces in isolation, because it all leads to the same source. And this is a matter of global concern. And you can see that the same issues are spreading to the Middle East, involving the Middle Eastern powers, and the recent tensions being created again by all goes back to the same source. And so it is important that the rest of the world comes together on especially the open democratic societies. Now, India has always been responsible. And even when we did not have the civil nuclear agreement with the US and Australia and with Japan, we were a responsible nuclear power, even though we were not part of the nuclear group as a signatory. But we never indulged in proliferation. We, in fact, actively checked proliferation activities by rogue countries. So we will behave responsibly as a member of the Security Council. But the fundamental issue is the UN structures are grossly out of date. These structures were set up in the late 1940s, and it is very odd that India, which is the second most populous nation in the world, and soon to be the third largest economy in the world, does not have a permanent position on the UN Security Council. This needs to change. Other countries are supporting India's position there, such as Japan and the United States and others. Whichever forum we are on, India will behave responsibly. We have recently been on the executive committee, the chairmanship of the World Health Executive Board, for instance. And we have just a little bit earlier talked about India's responsible actions in tackling this pandemic, both domestically as well as helping out other nations with our pharmaceutical industry and other abilities to produce PPE kits and so on and so forth. So India is committed to playing a responsible role.
Indeed. So you spoke about the post-World War II institutions being grossly out of date. And I think over the last 5 years, everyone would agree with that statement, including Roberto Azevedo, the head of the World Trade Organization, soon stepping down, Christine Lagarde when she was the head of IMF, and since then, even within the UN itself, there is talk across all the post-World War II institutions about reform. Prime Minister Modi has been an active part of this discussion and has called for a human-centric globalization or a human-centric multilateralism. Post-World War II, we were in a state of economic fragility as well. And while some of the UN institutions were focused on peace, many, like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the WTO, were focused on economic recovery and free trade. What does Modi mean by human-centric multilateralism or human-centric globalization? And does it fit neatly with a self-reliant India?
Indeed, it is aligned with the idea of a self-reliant India. But one of the things that Prime Minister Modi surely means is that people can't be ignored. And what does that mean? Mm-hmm. It means these post-World War II structures were dominated by powers that were economic powers, such as US, such as European nations, but they had much smaller populations than, for example, India. So India, with well over 1.3 billion people, does not enjoy a proportionate status in these post-World War II institutional structures. So the attitude was that economic abilities and military abilities outweigh human representation. And so that has to change. Human representation has to play a role in shaping geopolitics and shaping the security and prosperity of the world. But India is also becoming a major economic force. And so there is double justification for India to play a greater role. So that's what Prime Minister Modi means, that the world cannot be viewed as just that of the haves and have-nots, because the large numbers of the have-nots are becoming the haves. And the economic engine of the world is no longer just Europe and America. The economic engine of the world has shifted substantially to Asia. And to have only China be represented at that level of global institutions and where it harbors and shelters rogue states creates an imbalance. And that has to change.
That's an excellent point about human representation and making sure that humanity is front and center. Does human-centric globalization also address human or humane issues? And I refer now to Prime Minister Modi's phone calls earlier in the year to President Macron and to Chancellor Merkel. So France and Germany have also been very active in calling for friends of globalization and also for a human-centric globalization. But for France and Germany, I believe this means also looking at some of the major global challenges that affect humanity. So not just human representation, which is key and important, as you mentioned, but also looking at climate change and issues that affect the state of the world. And I know that G20 Sherpa Suresh Prabhu has been very active on climate change. Prime Minister Modi himself has been very active in ensuring India has one of the largest renewable energy shares, including innovatively hosting in partnership with France the International Solar Alliance, and has gone on to develop the CDRI, the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, in partnership with UK. And Australia has supported both of these global initiatives championed by India. But does human-centric involve these dimensions like climate change?
Indeed, this is another major issue. The debate about human-centric focus on global policies have hit a roadblock on the climate change issue, because for a long time now, developed nations have wanted to try and freeze the carbon footprints on a national basis and try to reduce it on a national basis without taking into account the population. So if you look at the carbon footprint of India, it seems large, but if you look at the number of the carbon footprints of the people, whereas when you look at the more developed nations, their carbon footprint is large as a nation and large on a per capita basis, on an individual basis. So to say that somehow Indians don't deserve to have some of the standards of life that we are used to, that Indians should not have more air conditioning or more refrigeration or more cars, that has never sat well, particularly when we are an open society and people debate this. So that has been one of the sticking points, because it calls for much more sacrifice from the developed nations. If you treat any Indian as equal to anybody in terms of sacrifice or commitment to tackling climate change, becomes more clear. But despite that, India has taken very bold steps in the last 5 or 6 you saw that in earlier years. Today, seeing the single fastest, remember, this is health grid parity or below grid parity than fossil fuels. So human-centric climate change policy way to ensure that we bring down our carbon footprint over the next. Very consistent what Prime Minister Modi is saying, whether it comes to representation at global institutions or tackling climate change, the human-centric approach ought to be really the only approach in democratic open societies.
No, it's a very good point. And indeed, when you talk about emissions per capita, India is in fact one of the lowest in the world, and Australia, regrettably, is one of the highest in the world, because our population is relatively small. So no, that's certainly a very valid point. But indeed, I think India, in its hosting of the International Solar Alliance and other efforts, including having targets of gigawatts for solar energy, really is moving in that very strong direction. And my understanding is, like South Korea and other countries who are investing in a stimulus post-COVID, India also has a green stimulus, which does involve solar energy and renewable green jobs as well. The final question I wanted to put to you is about Atmanirbhar Bharat. It seems very appropriate on the eve of Independence Day to talk about India's independence and self-reliance. We've spoken previously about the economy and how India is investing and underwriting itself for domestic production and investment. But obviously investment, as you've just pointed out with the focus on humans, is investment in people as well. And to that end, despite COVID and other distractions, India has passed the most transformative education policy in its history, well, certainly in the 21st century, with the new education policy announced just a few weeks ago. What's your take on the new education policy in terms of investing in India's demographic dividend, as we would say, in its youth? And do you see the new education policy as part of a self-reliant India?
Indeed, this is indeed transformative, because it's been a couple of decades overdue, at least. And India's education continued to suffer from the colonial overhang, much like many of our other policies, whether it came to economics or health or education, suffered from a colonial overhang. And we are gradually breaking free. As I said, this represents part of my thesis of a transition from diffidence to confidence. So I think the single biggest part of this transformation is the overt commitment to dramatically raise the public expenditure on education. To set a particular target as a percentage of GDP which is significantly higher than what is currently the case, is the most transformative aspect about it. But it's not just about money, because it's also about policies of how do you educate. And we need to break away from the kind of rote learning that we have inherited from colonial times, with an emphasis on, uh, uh, on aspects which may not always have relevance to what is necessary. The proposed restructuring of the education sector mirrors what countries have done over the last century. And this it has been done with input from a variety of stakeholders, input from parents, from teachers, from education experts, and those who have dedicated their lives to it. So I think I'll cite you one example. So one of the most famous philanthropic large-scale efforts in Indian education is by one of the Indian billionaires called Mr. Premji. And he's one of the Indian tech billionaires, and he has committed a very large part of his fortune towards his trust, which works in the education sector. And he has strongly welcomed this new education policy and says that we must implement it thoroughly. And the same kind of feedback has come from across the spectrum, irrespective of political allegiance. So I think that's a good sign, that it indicates that the policies itself, the new education policy itself, is being widely welcomed. This Prime Minister has shown that he's an implementer. He's not just somebody who talks about new policies. If you look at the policy changes that he has brought about in the last 6 years, they are historic and have put India at an inflection point away from its past slower development into a much more rapid development. And you're right, education has to be the underpinning of that growth, of that human capital, of that demographic dividend. And so this has created a great sense of optimism around the country, and we will see its impact in the coming few years.
Well, you make again an excellent point. You spoke at the beginning of our conversation about India being a civilization country and one of the oldest civilizations in the world. You also made the point that education has slipped as part of a colonial overhang. And we mustn't forget that India was one of the strongest and greatest contribution to knowledge thousands of years ago, with arguably the first university in the world, Nalanda University, and a huge amount of humanities and science produced out of that as well. You yourself, I think people, because you're so eloquent and have such a grasp of international relations and politics, people might forget you yourself have a science background. And I believe a graduate from Michigan Technology University. The NEP, in addition to focusing on education, focuses on research. Do you have any thoughts on research in terms of knowledge as power, on India's development for information technology and health, and the role that a new National Research Foundation might play in India's 21st century share of humanity and addressing global challenges?
Indeed, you rightly pointed out to India's long heritage for education and science and technology and research. Some of the Ayurvedic formulations for health are today big business around the world. And these were researched and tried out thousands of years ago. And India has that tradition of research and development, which it had forgotten for several centuries because of the colonial experience. And now we are coming back out of it again. So if you look at the modern era of R&D, one of the measures is how many PhDs are being produced by a country in science and technology. And you'll see that India had lagged far behind many other nations. That is going to change with this new education policy. There will be a greater incentivization in the system for higher knowledge dependent on research in education, in institutions of excellence. So you'll see more PhDs in the sciences and technology. But that doesn't mean the humanities are going to be forgotten either.
Yeah.
We have got this schism today from the last many decades that we've got lots of, say, basic engineering colleges, and we've got lots of basic liberal arts colleges, and we have an attitude that the twain shall never meet. And I think that's wrong. I think there has to be a more rounded education. And so this will help in doing that. If you look at history, for instance, most Indian history books have a peculiar fascination for just 300 or 400 years of the many thousands of years of recorded history that we have. That should also change. We have to have a more holistic view about who we were and how did we get here, and our relationship with the rest of the world. If you read Indian history books in the school textbooks, you'll get the impression that India was always a subjugated nation rather than this great ancient civilization that helped with trade and with science and with research. So this is a renaissance in a true sense of the Indian education system.
Well, it's been thoroughly a pleasure to speak with you today, Jay, as always. And you make some excellent points yet again on civilization. I know I've had the pleasure of visiting your home state of Odisha, where again you had, I think, a graduate college thousands of years old that Buddhists from Nalanda could come to the historic Buddhist civilizations in Odisha as well. It's an extraordinary state that you come from, and it's been a wonderful conversation on the eve of Independence Day, covering a range of issues from economic, security, health, and of course education. Self-Reliant India looks like it's really going to emerge as one of the absolute leaders of the 21st century, and we really thank you again for your time and being able to cover this range of issues.
Thank you very much, Tanya. It's been wonderful speaking to you.